Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about literature and the arts. I am Ito Otini.
And I'm Makaya Otini, and today we're speaking with Troy Jollimore. Troy holds a PhD in philosophy from Princeton, has published 4 collections of poetry, and has authored or edited 4 books of philosophy. His first collection, Thomson in Purgatory, won the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2006, and his third, Syllabus of Errors, appeared on the New York Times list of best books of poetry published in 2015. His work has also been supported by the Guggenheim Foundation, the Stanford Humanities Center in Palo Alto, California, and others. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our free newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities. To support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation through our website or purchase a subscription to our blog where you'll find more premium content and resources at thedatekeepers.com. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Troy, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you tell us about yourself and what are you working on now?
Sure, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm a poet and philosopher, and that sounds pretentious, but I actually have the qualifications in the sense that I have a PhD in philosophy and I teach philosophy as my job. So that's sort of, how I make my money, and it's a creative outlet in its own way, but then there's also the poetry, which has sort of been there forever, or at least as long as I can remember. I sort of went along for a while, I think, thinking that I would be happy to do either thing as a living and just wondering which one would turn out I could make a career in. And the philosophy thing has brought in more money, it's brought in stable employment, but it's allowed me to do both. So I've published 4 books of poetry, I've written 3 books of philosophy, and right now, you asked what I'm working on, I'm writing another book of philosophy. On the side, also some essays. I write literary essays and things like that as well.
That tells you a lot about the poetry world when you're like, oh yeah, no, my day job is as a philosopher, and that's
I know, right? That's what brings in the money.
Who are your favorite philosophers? I love philosophy. Every year I build my list of books to read, and always I put philosophy books there. Even if I read them many, many times, I reread them over and over.
Yeah. It's funny because, of course, contemporary philosophy doesn't have a good reputation in terms of readability. And
Yep.
a lot of academic philosophers they don't write to be read, and they don't really think about literary quality. But there are some that do, and I appreciate that when they do. Historically, some philosophers have been great writers, of course, going back to Plato, obviously.
Yeah.
Plato, his works are wonderful to read, and they're not dry essays, where he says, I will argue that, blah, blah. They're dialogues with people arguing about things. They're like little plays, they're so much fun. So, of course, I love Plato. I love Nietzsche. As anybody who likes fine philosophical writing, I think, has to love Nietzsche. He's so adventurous and, again, such a great literary writer, even if you're not agreeing with him or even if you're finding the ideas implausible, which I think sometimes they are, but I think he has a lot of interesting ideas too. The writing is so great that, it just carries you along.
Yeah, there are some things that I agree with and things that I disagree with Nietzsche, but even people who 100% disagree with him, as a writer, I can't say that his writing is bad. I have to be crazy to say that. But I think now the definition of philosophy is no longer what philosophy really is, because when I was in grad school, people would say, I'm philosophizing, meaning they're frying eggs or walking or chatting with a friend on the phone or Facebook or whatever. So it's now anything from taking shower to taking a walk. It's
Absolutely. I opened my fridge. This is true. Just a couple of days ago, I opened my fridge and there's a little carton of milk there. And the side that was facing me had information about the dairy and it said, our philosophy. And I thought, you just can't get away from philosophy. There's this broad use of the word that is just everywhere. And everybody has a philosophy about something.
And the other weird thing with the relationship of philosophy to other disciplines that I see is that, like, as the hard sciences have expanded and as the social sciences have expanded, it seems like they've taken over more and more territory that initially was really only dealt with by philosophers. There was a time period when you could be a philosopher and also a scientist because those disciplinary lines had not really emerged and there weren't really specialists in biology per se, so you were the specialist. What role do you see philosophers playing, or at least ideally, what role do you think philosophers could play in contemporary life now that so much of that intellectual territory has been annexed by other disciplines? Like, do you see the work of philosophers overlapping with other disciplines, or do you see it holding whatever space those disciplines cannot enter into? How do you conceive of that relationship?
That's a great question. I think there is some of both, but definitely a huge amount of overlap. And in fact, one of the reasons I got into philosophy in terms of studying it as an academic discipline. Because, I started out as an English major because I wanted to be a writer. And I thought, oh, obviously being an English major is the right choice. And it wasn't. And I figured out fairly quickly that, at least at the school where I happened to be, being an undergraduate in the English department just wasn't all that interesting. And it was sort of killing my desire to write. It wasn't right at all. Whereas I got exposed to philosophy through a number of ways and figured out very quickly that, oh, that's really exciting and that's really engaging me intellectually and making me want to write. And one of the things I realized at some point about philosophy was that regardless of which direction I ended up going in terms of my own interests and stuff, whatever it was, I would be able to do it as a philosopher. So if at some point I became interested in something more scientific, like biology or physics or whatever, I could do philosophy of biology. I could do philosophy of physics, right? If I ended up very interested in film, which I have, I can write about film from a philosophical perspective as a philosopher. So in a way, philosophy at this point especially almost doesn't have its own subject matter. There are very few things you can point to and say, well, only philosophers do that. But at the same time, there are very few things you can point to and say, well, a philosopher can't do that. And I love that about it because I can change my mind completely about what interests me now and then do that, whatever it is, as a philosopher. And I think that's really wonderful. I used to teach a course called Science and Human Values with a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, and he's a biologist. So we would discuss things, and very often I felt like my role as a philosopher was something like this. He would say, okay, here's an experiment that's been done that shows that we don't have free will. And then I would look at the experiment, we would read it through together, read it through the class and so on. And then I would say, yes, but it doesn't actually show that because here's 8 other things it might actually show instead. I think that a lot of contemporary analytic philosophy is really sort of marred by science envy. They want to be scientists or make it look like they're doing science or something like that. So they try to write like scientists. And so they write in a very impersonal, detached sort of way that is cold and kind of awkward. It's a little bureaucratic a lot of the time. And I don't think that that's necessary. It's not necessarily even in the interest of clarity, because in a lot of cases it's less clear because they're using jargon rather than just saying it in plain English, which might take a little work, but it's possible. So for me, it's avoiding all those sorts of emulations of science, with the formula and the jargon and stuff like that, and being willing to be somewhat personal and enter into, and say, look, here's what I think or something like that. Like, just let yourself into the essay because a human being is writing it, after all. And I think it's okay for the reader to know that this is a human being who is writing it. And then beyond all that, and this is maybe more gets to the fact that I am a poet as well and so on, but I do think about rhythm in sentences, and I do think about the well-constructed sentence that has a little music to it. And that's not something that, as far as I can tell, we're taught to do as philosophers. I've never had anybody say to me, when you're writing philosophy, think about the rhythm and think about how it feels in your mouth or something like that. But I think we should, because people should enjoy reading philosophy if it's possible.
And writing it. Like, that's part of the enjoyment of writing, too.
It's part of the enjoyment of writing it. And, when I read some of these philosophers that I love, Nietzsche, obviously, but contemporaries, Harry Frankfurt would be an example. He's a lovely writer. Bernard Williams is a really great writer who his sentences are just pleasurable. And you can tell he thought about it from a literary perspective. How is this going to feel to read? How is it going to sound if it were read aloud? And I don't think philosophers on the whole do that nearly enough. And as a result, a lot of philosophical prose these days is quite ugly. And I don't think it has to be ugly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was born and raised in Morocco, And philosophy was required in high school for 3 years. So our education system is different than in the US. We're more European. So I was required to take philosophy classes for 3 years. And in my last year, it was even required for the national exam. But the translation was extremely poor to the point that the meaning didn't come through. And the more I read, the more I got confused. And I hated philosophy. I was like, this doesn't really make any sense. And when I went to the university, in one of my extensive reading classes, I was given Sophie's World, and I read the book and I started reading one philosopher after another after I read that book. And that book not only helped me personally to think about everything, ethics, morality, and social issues and everything in an intellectual way, but like as a human being. And I was thinking, wow, was it intentional that the text that we were given in high school, was it intentionally poorly translated so that we wouldn't be interested in the subject, so that we would continue to be brainwashed? Until I learned English, that's when I started to love and enjoy philosophy. When I was reading it in Arabic, it was terrible.
Hmm. Yeah, the translation issue is huge, of course, and it's always such an interesting question if you're faced with a passage that you can't really make sense of. Is it that difficult in the original? Is it the writing of the original? Is it the fact that the ideas are just very difficult to grasp? Or is it a translation issue? And sometimes it turns out to be. And certainly, with some of the most important philosophers in our tradition, someone like Immanuel Kant, for instance, he was not always a great writer to begin with, and then some of the translations have had big issues, and so English language readers have really struggled with those translations and with trying to get at the original and actually, and there's still a lot of debate about what he was saying, and then part of it, again, I think is because he's a complicated thinker, but sometimes it's also just interpretive issues surrounding the text.
And then you've got someone like, I think, Heidegger, who insisted that his philosophy could not be translated out of German. It could only exist in German.
And I've heard people argue that it doesn't really exist there either. So, but no, I think he did. And it makes sense. And there is something to that. Translation is such a fascinating issue. And of course, as a poet, you end up thinking about it too, because there is that question of whether poetry can really be translated into other languages. And I love translations. I love translators and what they do. I think it's wonderful to try to take a text and carry it across into another language. But I do also acknowledge the other side of the debate that you never really get the same poem at the end of the day. A poem is so intimately wrapped up with its own language that whatever you end up with in something else, it's a version of it in some sense, but it's also a different work.
Well, and I think as a multilingual person, I think it's just like what we said earlier. Eating fried eggs makes you a philosopher. Now, knowing how to use Google makes you a translator. There are some fields where everyone who feels like they want to be there, they just join. There's no gatekeeping. But if we are to translate texts culturally and linguistically, then we have to make sure that the translator is competent linguistically and culturally in both sides. I met people who claim to speak the languages I speak, and some languages I don't even feel comfortable to say that I can translate in those languages. And there are people who are like so poor at speaking and reading and writing those languages, and yet they are out there translating books. And translation is an oath, and it's a hard job.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I completely agree. I have such respect for people who take it seriously and do it well, because it's extraordinarily difficult in a way that readers and people in general often don't really appreciate. They often have a somewhat naive view that there's a meaning there to be captured, and you just read the original, you know what it means, you write it down in the other language, and you're done. There's so much more to it than that. It doesn't work that way at all, really.
So let's talk a little bit about your poetry. What's your latest book of poems that you're working on? What themes are you treating, and what is its relationship to your prior works?
I'm still trying to figure that out in a way. I'm between books, haven't written a lot of poetry recently, or nothing that feels very finished anyway. I mean, I've got stuff on paper. I've written stuff that as attempts, and I often find that poetry, for me, my poetry, it has to go through some very radical transformations usually before it ends up as whatever it's really trying to be. So there's that initial stage of just putting stuff down on the paper and sort of being baffled by it, looking at what I've written and thinking, what is that? I wrote that, did I? Like, what am I trying to say when I write this? And I'm going by feel and I'm going by sound, something sounds right to me or sounds interesting or aesthetically appealing on some level. And so I write it down and don't really worry about the meaning. One thing I generally don't do as a poet is start by knowing the meaning of something that I want to say and figuring out how to say it. If I'm in that situation, I'm more likely to write an essay or something like that. A poem is something different. I don't know what the poem's going to say until it's finally done. And that can be a very long process. And it's sort of the same with the book of poems in a way. I look at each of my books now, the 4 that I've published, and each one of them to some degree feels unified. It's got a body, it's got a being that sort of holds together. There's a certain kind of cohesion in it. But it didn't feel that way when I was writing it in each case. I didn't know what I was doing. I would sit down and try to write something, and hopefully something would come out, and sometimes it wouldn't, or again, it would come out, but it was wrong, and I knew I had to fix it. And over a few years of just doing that over and over and over with a whole bunch of different pieces, I got enough individual works that I was happy with that I could then sort of assemble into something and then start to get a sense of what it was. I remember after my second book came out, looking back on that book now, I can see very clearly that it was about some difficulties that I was going through in my life. And there's a lot of poems in that book about being sort of 2 different people in the same body or something like that, or somehow being split, not being at peace with yourself or not being in harmony with yourself or whatever. That's very obvious to me now, looking back at it. But while I was writing it, I had no idea. And even just after it had come out, I really had no idea. But I remember getting a call from a friend who said, he had just read the book. And I said, oh, great. What did you think? And there was this long pause. And then he said, well, are you okay? 'Cause, that's,
Wow.
yeah. And I actually hadn't been completely okay but I didn't know. Like, some part of me was obviously in touch with that and was writing about it. But the more conscious part of me still had sort of yet to figure that out. But it was coming out in the poems.
So what was going on? Why were you experiencing that sense of schism?
There were a lot of things going on. I was in the wrong place in my life in a certain way. I had made some decisions that I had to correct in certain ways. I had to figure out how to be myself in my life. I think I still have to figure that out, but I think I'm closer now, at least somewhat, than I was then. This might sound very abstract, I don't know, but for a while I could sense a schism in my life, and I thought the schism was sort of between philosophy and poetry or something like that. And then one of the things that happened that was really helpful to me was that I realized that no, that wasn't the schism at all. Those are both on the same side. The philosophy and the poetry are actually both important parts of who I really was, and the schism was more that I hadn't figured out a way to really incorporate those fully into my life. It was like both of those things were something I did kind of on the side, but I wasn't really living them. I was just doing them almost as a hobby. And so I had to figure out how to kind of invest myself in them and actually be a philosopher and be a poet and have that as a genuine, authentic part of my life.
So are you interested in the same subjects as a philosopher as you are as a poet? Or do you find that your interests diverge depending on which genre you're working in?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think the answer is partly yes, I'm definitely interested in the same things, both as a philosopher and as a poet. But at the same time, there's differences in the writing. There are things that I can write about as a philosopher that it's much harder for me to write about as a poet, or vice versa. A good example, I think, would be love. I'm very interested in love, both as a human being and as a thinker. As somebody, again, who's really into Plato, and, I think Plato's Symposium is one of the great works of Western philosophy. I'm not going out on a limb and saying that. Everybody with any sense probably thinks that. But it's natural for me to be very interested in love as a philosophical topic, and I became interested in it as a grad student. And also as a poet, but as a poet, I find it much harder to write about. It's very hard to write love poems. So as a philosopher, I've written a book on love and several papers, and I'm writing another book on philosophy of love now. I seem to have a lot to say about it. I don't know if any of it's right, but I seem to have a lot to say about it. As a poet, I've written and published a few love poems. And people sometimes ask me, why haven't you written more? And I'll say, well, I've actually tried. And I've written some that you'll never see because they just don't work. And then I've tried to write some and they turned into something else because they didn't want to be that. I was telling them, oh, be a love poem. But the poem says, no, I want to be about something else. I'm not about love. So I don't want to write or publish a bad love poem. So I end up writing very few. And people have asked me that sometimes, why is there so much love in your philosophy and not much in your poetry?
Why is that?
Maybe it's something about the kind of distance or detachment I have to take from it as a poet so that I don't just end up sort of gushing or writing a love poem in the sense of, oh, I love you, I love you. I mean, I've got people in my life, starting with my wife, Heather, of course, who I would love to say that to, and I do say that to in a personal way. Face to face, I say that. But in a poem, I've written a couple poems that I think basically do that. But I find it very hard to do that without it feeling sentimental in some way or objectionable, that you're just borrowing the strength of the feeling and trying to use that to drive the poem. And to me, that almost always feels fake, even if the feeling, in fact, behind it is real, because I know it's real. And that's why I can say it to her in my personal life. But when it gets onto the page and it gets out in a journal or it's out in a book or something like that, that reality sort of gets left behind in some way. And now, unless you're, an extremely gifted writer, you can't make it feel real in that way. So a love poem that works, or at least that kind of love poem, is one where the writing is so good that it does feel authentic. Elizabeth Bishop has this poem called The Shampoo, which I think is one of the great love poems. And it feels completely authentic to me. It feels completely real. Theodore Retke has a couple, he's got one called Wish for a Young Wife. And those poems are ones where somehow they get past this, I was going to say trap. I don't know if trap is quite the right word, but there's a real difficulty, for me at least, in putting authentic feeling into a poem in a way that feels authentic. And as a result, a large amount of the poetry that I've published, I'm not going to say it's not emotional or not personal. And I think over the years it's become more so because I've learned how to do it somewhat. But a lot of it is a little detached in a way, or it's a little ironic. It might be about feelings rather than expressing feelings or something like that.
That's really interesting
Yeah,
because
thanks.
in high school, my final exam, we were given 3 questions and we would choose to answer one. And it was a question, a quote, or a statement. And I loved the statement because I thought that's how you were going to answer, is that writing about culture, languages, emotions require discussion. And I don't see the opportunity to do that in poetry, but through philosophy, you could actually discuss it and make your readers think about the subject of love.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's already in philosophy, because of its nature as an intellectual endeavor, a kind of detachment that's sort of implicit. You're removing yourself from it in order to observe it and try to come up with a theory of it. And I think that that's a great endeavor that is worth doing and in some ways has enhanced my personal life. It's not that I don't bring that back into my personal life, but in and of itself, it's not the kind of thing that you can read to the person you're in love with or something and have them feel great about. Like, it's not that kind of thing at all. It's not like a love poem. It's psychology, it's theory, right? It's got a very different purpose and a different feel.
So, at the risk of asking you to distill something that really can't be distilled into this short of format, can you share a little bit of your theory of love?
I could probably say something really quick about that. I'll talk about the 2 books, the one I've published and the one I'm working on now. The first book, which came out like a decade and a half ago now, which is insane. Time is going so fast. That one's called Love's Vision. It began with me pushing back against certain theories of love that are quite commonly held among a lot of people, including Harry Frankfurt, who was my dissertation advisor as a grad student, who thinks there's just no reasons for love at all, and it's basically not a matter of reason or rationality or anything like that. It's just feeling, and feeling has nothing to do with reasons. And
Interesting.
I have a different view of feeling because I'm more of an Aristotelian, so I think that emotions are closely linked to beliefs and judgments and reasons, and so you can have reasonable and unreasonable emotions. Like, you can get angry at someone for good reason, or you can get angry at somebody for a stupid reason, and you shouldn't be angry at all, right? So I think it's the same thing with love in some sense, but I also think there's limits on that. It's not just having reasons, and it's not like, having an argument and here's my proof that I should love you or something like that. That's crazy. So the first book was an attempt to try to figure that out. How can there be reasons in love to some degree without that sort of taking over to the point where it becomes this coldly rationalistic enterprise? which we definitely don't want it to be. And it's called Love's Vision because the model of love that I try to work on there is one that sees love as largely a kind of perception, or it's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of seeing a particular person, seeing them in a certain light, which I think in a way is just common sense, but the philosophical elaboration of it hopefully has something to it. And then the book that I'm working on now sort of presupposes that, but isn't really about that. It's much more now about love and time, which is something I didn't talk about much in the first book, and questions about, could there be such a thing as love at first sight? What's the nature of commitment in love? Like, how is it that if I say now, oh, I promise to stay with you the rest of my life and love you, or whatever, how can I even promise to do that given how long the period of time is and that our emotions aren't really under our control and so on, right? So what am I really doing when I make that sort of commitment, or is it even something I can do? And then as it happens, I'm very interested in movies. And so I'm writing about a few fairly recent films that I think are perceptive about love, that have something to say about this stuff. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is one. Actually, the films that I'm working on most, or writing about most, I thought I'd have a chapter on the Before trilogy, which I don't know if you know these films, Before Sunrise, and then there's 2 sequels.
No.
Oh, they're lovely, lovely films. And one of the great things about them is each of them is filmed like 9 years apart. So Before Sunrise comes out in the early 90s, and then 9 years later, the 2 characters meet up again, and it's called Before Sunset. And then 9 years later, it turns out they've been together all this time, but there's this 3rd installment where you see them again. And so you actually watch the actors get older, and you really believe that these people sort of have spent time together and have this relationship and know each other. And it's just a really sort of brilliant series of films in terms of commenting on love, not just from the perspective of your ordinary romantic comedy where, oh, it's these 2 attractive people and are they going to get together? Well, of course they are, whatever it is, but about how it actually does develop over time, and how people's feelings change and how that can be difficult, but also rewarding in certain ways. You get to know somebody on a whole different level, right? And so they're wonderful films. And I thought I'd just have a chapter on the trilogy, and now it's turning out that the book is largely about that trilogy because I think there's so much to say about it because those 3 films have so much to say.
You make me think about my time back when I arrived to the US back in 2017. And I was walking to my apartment and someone helped me carry things and I thanked them. And the person said, "Thank you, I love you." And I thought, did I hear that right? And I say this because, again, I am a multilingual, and the word love in English is applied to everything. Like, I love my partner, I love my computer, I love my tomatoes, I love my garden, I love basically anything. My stories that I write, one word is used in different situations. But for example, in Arabic, if you want to say to your romantic partner, "I love you," it's a different word than saying to your friend, "I love you."
Hmm.
Have you thought of writing about love in different languages?
I've definitely thought about that difference in concepts, although I didn't know that about Arabic, and that's very interesting. And in fact, in a way, as a philosopher, one of the first things you sort of decide in terms of what you think about love is, do you think it's essentially the same phenomenon, whether you're saying that you love your husband or your wife, or whether you're just saying, I love Thai food, whatever it is. And some people do it. I think, no, it's just the same concept, applied to different things. And so again, Harry Frankfurt, who really influenced my view and stuff, he thought that. Essentially, he thought that. And I just think that's wrong. I think that love for a human being is a very different sort of thing than even the most passionate commitment to something other than a person. Because among other things, a human being can love you back, right? It can be mutual and they can know that you love them. And you don't just, you say, I love Thai food, but you don't say it to Thai food, right? That's something different. Whereas, when you
Yeah.
love somebody, you say it to them, I love you. And I think that that is a completely different phenomenon. And then I'm thinking about what you said about the Arabic word, that it's different for friends and for romantic lovers. And I think that's a very interesting question, because I do have a tendency to think of romantic love as kind of a type of friendship, but there's obvious ways in which it is deeply quite different as well, and unique and interesting in its own right.
Well, we always ask our guests to read some of their work. Do you have anything you would like to share with us?
Sure. Why don't I read a couple of my poems? And I'll start with a poem that's actually quite philosophical. Maybe a little less so these days, but for a long time I was very averse to letting philosophy into poems. I really sort of tried to keep them separate. And on the rare occasions when I would, like in this poem, it was almost always bad philosophy. It was like a joke. I'm not making an argument. I'm making an argument I know is bad and shouldn't convince anybody. So this poem, this is from my second book, At Lake Skugog. The poem is called The Solipsist. So a solipsist, of course, is a person who thinks, they're the only person who exists in the universe. It's all in their head or something like that. So this is called The Solipsist. Don't be misled. That sea song you hear when the shell's at your ear, it's all in your head. That primordial tide, the slurp and salt slosh of the brain's briny wash, is on the inside. Truth be told, the whole place, everything that the eye can take in, to the sky and beyond into space, lives inside of your skull. When you set your sad head down on Procrustes' bed, you lay down the whole universe. You recline on the pillow. The cosmos grows dim. The soft ghost in the squishy machine, which the world is, retires. Someday it will expire. Then all will go silent and dark. For the moment, however, the blackness is just temporary. The planet you carry will shortly swing back from the far nether regions, and life will continue, but only within you. Which raises a question that comes up again and again as to why God would make ear and eye to face outward, not in.
That's great.
Yeah,
Thanks. One of the things I like about that poem, it presents a bad philosophical argument, and then at the end it offers an objection to itself, and then just stops there, so I enjoy that part of it. This is a nice companion piece in a way. I think it's a little more sincere. I guess it's a love poem. We were talking about love poems, so here's one that I did, and the other poem mentioned planets and some of that cosmic imagery, and so we have some of that here too. So this is called On the Origins of Things. Everyone knows that the moon started out as a renegade fragment of the sun, a solar flare that fled that hellish furnace and congealed into a flat frozen pond suspended between the planets. But did you know that anger began as music, played too often and too loudly by drunken musicians at weddings and garden parties? Or that turtles evolved from knuckles, ice from tears, and darkness from misunderstanding? As for the dominant thesis regarding the origin of love, I abstain from comment, nor will I allow myself to address the idea that dance began as a kiss, that happiness was an accidental import from Spain, that the ancient game of jump the fire gave rise to politics. But I will confess that I began as an astronomer, a liking for bright flashes, vast distances, unreachable things, a hand stretched always toward the furthest limit, and that my longing for you has never taken me far from that original desire, to inscribe a comet's orbit around the walls of our city, to gently stroke the surface of the stars.
Thank you.
That's delightfully disorienting.
Well,
That's
thank
a
you
nice
so much
response.
for making the time.
Oh, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
thank
Troy.
you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.